Price is not a concern. Now, that's not something I heard when I applied to colleges. Members of the jury, my name is Rachel Levy, and when I was in high school, my family was struggling. I worked and saved up just to take my college admissions exams. I pushed myself hoping to qualify for some scholarships. I remember borrowing money to pay for my college applications. And when I received my first college acceptance, I burst into my parents' room, screaming and crying from the excitement. I was so proud of all of my hard work paying off. Price is not a concern. Some parents want their children to do their best, but the defendant, she just wanted the best. And she thought that her wealth, her notoriety, and her fame would help her get it. Skip past stories like mine and millions of other students in the United States. Because to the defendant, price is not a concern. But when you can afford to bend the rules, you need to be willing to pay the price. In 2015, Mel Tam wanted the best for her daughter, not for her daughter to do her best. So the defendant decided to pay her daughter's way into a university the defendant knew was unrealistic. She hired Spencer Matthews, an admissions consultant from Reach for the Stars, to help her daughter, Jewel Tam, with college applications. But the truth was, Mr. Matthews did not work in admissions consulting. Over 95% of his business came from helping wealthy individuals like the defendant get their children admitted to elite universities by rigging the system in their favor. Today, you'll hear about the elaborate scheme that Mr. Matthews and the defendant plotted, and that she paid for every step of this process. While this case is about fraud, it's not about stealing or taking money from people. It's just about taking something. And it's about knowingly and intentionally scheming to get something in return for false pretenses or representations. It's about lying to get what you want, knowing that what you're presenting is wrong. And in this case, it's about using wire communications to do it. Now, this can be anything from sending an email to making a phone call to wiring money. Now, I know this might seem a bit confusing, but in this case, there's only 3 things we need to remember as we go. Mel Tam thought she could afford to bend the rules. She felt entitled to the results, and she intended to get them. Now, first, when it came to bending the rules, the defendant was willing to pay whatever it took to do it. Today, the evidence will show that Mel Tam spent a total of $155,000 on Spencer Matthews' services. She spent $10,000 of her money on official advising and $140,000 on a charitable donation to cover up the real purpose of her money. Now, she gave these first 2 amounts to Mr. Matthews on the day they first met. Now, I want to talk about those 2 checks for a minute. You'll hear that Ms. Tam doesn't even remember any advising happening after she paid $10,000 for it officially. She can't remember who tutored Jewel to improve her test scores, but she proudly showed Matthews the test results, showing that Jewel improved her score by over 400 points. Now, as for that second check, you'll hear that the defendant donated $140,000 to a charity that she first heard about on that very same day. Mr. Matthews will tell you that Front of the Classroom is officially a nonprofit organization, but really it functioned as a shell corporation to allow his illegal admissions consulting business to function without suspicion. He will say that reporting 6 figures for admissions consulting raises eyebrows, but donating 6 figures to a charity raises no suspicions. But with these checks, these meetings, and this planning, Mel Tam participated in an effort to use false pretenses to admit her daughter to colleges both she and Mr. Matthews agreed were out of reach. And the defendant paid to be part of this scheme because price is not a concern. And because she felt entitled to the results of that scheme, members of the jury, you will hear that the defendant wanted to get her daughter into the best school, regardless of the consequences and regardless of the cost. We will show you today that the defendant used wire communications in 2 ways in carrying out this scheme with Mr. Matthews. First, she emailed Mr. Matthews when she arranged their plans to defraud colleges and university admissions to get her daughter admitted. And second, she spoke to Mr. Matthews on the phone after arrests were made for other people involved in defrauding colleges and university admissions. You will hear that she told Mr. Matthews she was relieved he wasn't arrested, that he didn't need to worry about how much Jewel knew. And when Mr. Matthews told her to tell the FBI that she just hired him for admissions consulting, she said, "I understand." The evidence will show that in every interaction that the defendant had with Mr. Matthews or his fraudulent company, she behaved like she was above the law, like she'd be able to get away with it, because she felt entitled to the results. And members of the jury, she intended to get them. The evidence today will show you that the defendant acted with intent when she participated in Mr. Matthews' scheme. While the defense will try to tell you a story about Mel Tam as a passenger to this car crash, the truth is she was anything but a backseat driver. The defendant emailed Mr. Matthews to initiate their meeting. You'll see the defendant was at this first meeting with Mr. Matthews, where she plotted with him on how to carry out their fraudulent scheme. Mr. Matthews will tell you that the defendant got right to the point in that meeting. She said, "I'm not concerned with the morality. I just want what's best for my daughter." When Mr. Matthews called to make sure the Tam family wouldn't tell the FBI about their plans, you'll learn that he didn't call her husband. He called the defendant, and you'll hear that she answered the call. Now, when it comes to participating in this scheme, the defendant was involved in every stage. You'll hear that this scheme involved a fake golf career reported on Jules' college resume and bribing a golf coach at the University of Scenic, California. While the defense will argue that these efforts didn't affect Jules Tam's admission to UC Berkeley, the evidence will show that these claims about Jules' athletic career impacted every application she submitted. Her resume was still altered. Her application still contained false information. And while the defense will tell you that Mel Tam knew nothing about this, she will tell you herself that she is involved in all aspects of her children's lives, that she read Jules' personal statement, knew every school her daughter applied to, and even had a copy of Jules' score report from the SAT. The evidence will show that the defendant knew about every part of the fraudulent applications she helped submit, the applications that led to acceptance letters, because she intended to get results, because price is not a concern. But when you can afford to bend the rules, you need to be willing to pay the price. But she only pays that price, members of the jury, if I do the job that I went to school to do today. Now, we have the burden of proof for you today. We have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant committed honest services wire fraud, that she knowingly devised or participated in a scheme to defraud using false pretenses, representations, that she acted with intent to defraud colleges and universities where her daughter applied, and that she used wire communications to do it. And we will prove this to you today. At the end of this trial, there will be no other conclusion you can reach other than a guilty verdict, because the defendant made it clear every step of the way. The price was no concern. So now she needs to pay it. Thank you.